development of theoretical tools. So with that, Brian, I will pass it over to you and you can take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Mackenzie. I'll just share my screen here. Hello, everyone. And so Mackenzie asked me to talk about forecasting and management associated with invasive species today, and so I'll do so. And I thought it'd be fun to talk about it across different scales, as well as different systems. All right, so I want to first start by talking about large generalities or large commonalities across different systems and across different scales that allow us to examine these different predictive models using relatively similar ideas and techniques, right? And so after that, I will go into some of our specific research and give examples at the global scale where we're looking at marine systems and trying to look at the introductions caused by ships. We'll move then to a continental scale and examine a number of different projects from aquatic invasions as well as from forest insect pests, so both aquatic and terrestrial. And then I'll go all the way down to regional predictions and looking at aquatic invasions again and spread by boats. Right. So I suspect that most of the people here probably know a lot of this information already, but just in case, I figured it would be good to go through some of the key ideas in invasion biology and how they link together, right? So the idea of invasions, it's not rocket science, right? So basically, species come from some other location and they get transported to a new area. And most of the time, that's by human-mediated methods. When they get to the new area, they can become established, and this is going to be dependent upon population dynamics, the environmental conditions there, etc. And it's at that point that they can increase their abundance and spread and cause impact. Right now, each of these different sections, and I'm showing you a relatively long equation here, and you really don't have to worry about it. Right. My only point here is that each of these different components has subcomponents associated with it that people have examined and that are useful or provide opportunities to improve the predictions. Right. Another element, so transport links essentially with what's called propagular pressure, and that's a number or dose of individual invaders being brought from one area to another area. And obviously, as propagular pressure increases, the probability of establishment increases, etc. But nonetheless, we usually don't have a direct measurement of propagular pressure. It itself is going to be dependent upon a number of different elements. And again, you don't have to know this. It just shows that there's a number of different pieces associated with it. And most of the time, we won't have direct measurements of any of these things. But what we will have is we will have predictors or proxies of it. Okay, so you can see here that some of these terms occur in many of the different sub-elements. And while it's hard to measure the actual number of individuals being introduced, we can often measure these proxies. So we often can examine environmental conditions, something about the vector type, or something about the human behavior patterns, right? And something about the species. And we use these predictors and proxies often to build our statistical models or our predictive models. So that really is a key point associated with this, because that is going to tie in with everything else and why we are able to make these models across a wide range of circumstances. So another commonality is that the policy options occurs throughout the invasion process, right? So before invasion occurs, we have certain things that we can do, such as prevention, such as risk screening, inspections, these types of things, right? Afterwards, we can do things such as rapid response and eradication, and then once they have established, we can do things such as slow the spread. I just showed two different papers here, one from 2006, one from 2016, and you can see that a lot of the management strategies and a lot of the specific recommendation has remained relatively constant throughout the last decade, right? And do tie in essentially with this invasion process. And so we can think about the consequences of these different management strategies on that invasion process to try to make your inferences. Another thing I thought would be good to mention is that when we think about these different stages, right, oftentimes it's actually the same set of processes, right? So if I'm interested in spread, I can also conceptualize it using the same logic as I did for the primary invasion. All right, so I can think about it as, for example, the arrival and establishment to different lakes in a system, right? After it has got into the continental North America, right? Or different patches on a terrestrial landscape. The idea, though, is that a lot of the logic transcends or is applicable across different scales. And this ties into what kind of data can we use to build the model. And the data available has dramatically changed over the last decade and a half, where we have a massive amount of data globally with which we can start building these models, right? So if you link these with some of the predictors or some of the proxies I had just mentioned, you can start seeing how, well, hopefully you can start seeing how we can start constructing some of these things, right? So some of the main data sources that we have available are the physical environment, and we have remote sensing, satellite imagery across the world for physical environmental conditions, such as elevation, such as rivers, such as temperature, right? So all these different things that are going to be important for the invasion process, we can have estimates of those across space and often time. Another thing that we often have is very, very big databases on biological records, right? So we have occurrence databases. A lot of times we have survey databases with which we can use a lot of these models. And finally, we actually have a lot of data on human behavior, right? So we have information on agriculture, trade, right? Different shipping routes, different movement patterns. All these different things form the building blocks by which we can build our models. And more than that, people have started also making projections into the future. A lot of these things are linked with climate change, but also turn out to be very, very useful for making projections for biological invasions. This includes both the physical environment for things such as temperature, precipitation, all these different things, but also the social conditions, which also tie in with biological invasions. So things such as global population size, GDP, etc. Right, so just in summary, we can build our models across scales and systems using essentially common building blocks. And these common building blocks include the conceptual ones, right? So the invasion process, sets of predictors and proxies. So these relate to propagule pressure, environmental conditions, and species traits. And also the public databases, which are becoming increasingly available. And then it just becomes a question of how do we start merging these things together to answer the kind of questions that we're interested in answering. Right, so let me move now to some of the actual science and some of the actual projects that we have been working on over the last few years. Right, so one of the things we were interested in doing was estimating global biological invasions. And we were focusing in this particular instance on marine invasions. We know that shipping is one of the main routes by which organisms are moved throughout the world. We know that it is one of the main pathways. And of course, shipping isn't done randomly. There's a reason why we do these things, right? We do because we want material, we want goods and different types of products, right? And so this too is going to be related to essentially macroeconomic predictors, or that is the hypothesis anyways, right? So it seems reasonable that we could potentially use macroeconomic predictors to help us predict shipping routes or shipping patterns and how those should change over time, and then link those with biological invasions. And so that's essentially what we did a couple of years ago. And what we used was what we call a ROG model, or residual unadjusted unconstrained gravity model. Now, you don't need to know the details about that, all right? But basically, it's a model structure that is used quite commonly in economics. And we added essentially a residual adjustment to it, wherein because we know who all the countries are, who all the actors are. The deviation from the gravity model itself can be predictable, okay? So I'm probably not explaining that super well, but basically there's many different factors that do not explicitly go into the model. So historical trade, you know, patterns, you know, infrastructure in different countries, right? So all those can potentially be captured in those residual adjustments. All right. So basically the data that we had available to build this model was essentially all the shipping traffic across the world for 9 years, which included about 50 million voyages. And we can start seeing the extent to which we can estimate or recapture some of those patterns. Now, I mentioned some of the macroeconomic predictors, and so we could see whether these would help us make those predictions, and we could test that explicitly, right? So these would include things such as GDP of both source and destination, population size, distance between the different countries, right? Common language, colonial history, trade agreements. These are all things which have been argued in the literature to affect trade, and so we can examine those and see how they also affect the shipping. Right, and it turns out that the model actually works really, really well. And not only that, it is able to capture changes in the shipping pattern, which is of course crucial for our purposes. And so what we did was we built the model on 2006 to 2009, and then we tried to predict 5 years later in 2014, right? So we built it on one part of the data set, tried to predict essentially the future. In this case, 2014 was our validation year, okay? And so what we found was that we could basically capture the shipping traffic 5 years after the fitting data, okay? And basically capture about 90% of the variation. This graph here just shows the predicted vessel traffic from the model, from the ROG model, and the actual observed vessel traffic, right? And again, this accounts for a twofold growth in shipping between these dates. So the next thing we can do is we can also try to predict how the world should change, right? How shipping should change. And because it is going to be linked with these macroeconomic predictors, and because the climate change people have been also trying to find scenarios or create scenarios of different pathways of growth, we can then go and leverage that work and integrate it with our ROG model. Right, so they have what's called shared socioeconomic pathways, which essentially look at different ways of growth, and that includes things such as GDP, population size, which are key elements of our model. And so when we start integrating those projected changes in the economics of the world, in the macroeconomics of the world, and combine that with our ROG model, it actually projects increased traffic by about 240% to about 1,200%, right? So quite a large potential increase in the traffic, which is then going to potentially translate to biological invasions. And so it turned out that a bioinvasion model already existed. And so we decided to just use the one that was created by Siebens et al., who had parameterized or related historical invasions to the amount of shipping that occurred before, right? So we can examine that, and we can also combine it with expected changes in the environment, so IPCC climate scenarios, to then go and examine what our expectations are for how invasion should change over time as well. And so our predictions, when we bring all this information together, is that invasions could increase by 3 to 20%. Other things that were kind of interest is that in this context, shipping seemed to have a much greater effect than climate change on invasions, and that Northeast Asia was the most important source, which is important because most of the research is done more in Western countries, right? So North America, Europe has way more research done on invasive species, and yet the currently and the up-and-comer is basically Northeast Asia. Right? So these amount of invasions, however, doesn't include some of the policies which have been recently enacted, because of course it is too recent to actually have seen effect. But our results could be used to highlight why these management strategies are very, very important. And potentially, as you start to be able to parameterize the consequence of them, to be able to adjust and say how much improvement or how much benefit these management strategies allowed, right? So I'm not sure if people are aware of it, but basically there's a ballast water management convention. As always, these things take a long time to develop. And so, they first started talking about these things in the early 90s, and only recently did it actually enter into force, right? And so hopefully these will mitigate a lot of the invasions that are anticipated, right? All right, so now I want to shift scales, shift systems, and think about invasion risk within a given continent, right? So I want to zoom into North America and think about the aquarium pathway this time, right? So aquatic invasions, freshwater aquatic invasions. Right. So once again, we're going to think about what kind of data we have available, and then how that links with our models and with our projections. Right. So in this case, we had import records of what types of species and how many species are being brought in to a country. All right. And so this is going to be our surrogate or our proxy of propagule pressure. Right. And I'll show you how that's done in a minute. Right. To disaggregate this and to start getting spatial resolution, we also have demographic information, and we're going to make assumptions that basically the behavior patterns of people in different places are the same. Now, we can probably improve those models in the future, but basically as a first pass, that makes a lot of sense. And then to relate propagule pressure to establishment, we also have establishment records. Okay. And so we can then go and try to figure out how well one helps to predict the other. Right now, I had mentioned another proxy that often is useful is environmental predictors. And so we also have estimates worldwide of biological variables and also how they may change over time, right? So things such as the minimum temperature, precipitation, diurnal range, temperature in the coldest month, et cetera. So estimates of variability. And so the other one is species traits. Right? So traits such as maximum temperature, minimum temperature, tolerable by that specific species. So we can start incorporating these different predictors into our model to estimate how establishment should occur and change over time. Right? And this is a relatively simple formulation, but you'll see this repeatedly over time. Right? So basically, this is just a probability model. So we're thinking about invasion in terms of risk, okay? And there's a probability of establishing. And to calculate that, it's essentially going to be linked as the complement of the probability not establishing, right? So that's Q here, raised to the power of n. So n here is essentially our surrogate of propagule pressure. So that's mathematically how these things relate, okay? And we can add an additional coefficient in here to take into account some of the population dynamical considerations, such as the Lee effects, wherein at low population sizes, the population may be less likely to establish, and then it accelerates as the number of increases, right? So that affects the invasion trajectory and has been shown to be important. And so we can incorporate some of those features into our models, right? So this is a pretty simple equation, but we can expand upon this to start trying to figure out how to incorporate other things, right? So this probability of a propagule establishing or not establishing, so Q, right, is probably not uniform for all species or across all environmental conditions, right? So we want to make essentially Q a function of all of these other potential variables, all of these are potential predictors. And so essentially what we can do is we can just dump it into a logistic form and look at the relation with environmental variables and with species trait variables, right? So we can essentially expand that where ZS, right, where this term here gets expanded to include environmental variables and species traits, right? The coefficients here are just weighting functions, and basically all we're looking for are polynomials, okay, which just basically says that there can be an optimum associated with like temperature, for example, or environmental ranges, right? There is some area that is best for a given species, right? And we might also think that different species, that different species prefer different types of environmental conditions, right? So, the temperature range might act with the temperature tolerances of given species, for instance. And we can incorporate that essentially as the interaction terms, right? So I'm just showing you some of the different component parts of the model and how we start integrating them together to make our predictions. And so this model, we call it a PET model, which is kind of appropriate given our subject matter, right? But it basically incorporates those three proxy variables, those three predictor variables, propagule pressure, right? Which is, again, estimated by the import records, modified by demographics, the environmental conditions and the traits and their interactions, which influences the probability of establishment, right? And we can also examine them and see whether that model or the combination of those three elements predicts better than the alternative models. And basically, this AIC is a metric of how well the model works, and the lower the number, the better. And so you can see that basically that PET model that includes all of these different predictors worked better than all the other ones. And so that is ultimately the one we went with, right? And so then we can plot those out across the different states as well. This project actually originated because the Quebec government was interested in the risk due to aquatic invaders, due to the aquarium pathway. And so they actually funded this project. And so that's why, but the United States actually has much better data than us. And so that's why we built it primarily for the States and then also extrapolated to Quebec, right? But basically we can bring all that information together and make predictions about the relative risk, the number of expected invasions across the different states and the different regions, okay? And so what we find is that, well, Quebec does increase, but basically it's very, very low risk. It remains very low risk, and that's not necessarily surprising, all right? It goes from really, really low to really low, right? And so basically, even in 2050, after all of climate change and after all the population growth and population changes, we're still really talking about expected number of invasions of like much, much less than one. So contrast that against places like Florida, right? So these are the places that are already very high risk turn out to be the places that will be also, it will have the most new invaders and will be affected the most by things such as climate change and population growth, right? And in this case, in contrast to the marine system, it turns out that climate change is probably a more important predictor than propagule pressure, right? So propagule pressure in this case is going to be influenced by changes in demographics, so population growth, okay? Whereas climate change here basically causes a 25% increase in risk. Propagule pressure only causes a 7% increase in risk, and the combination of both cause about 35% increase in risk. So these are based on the fitted models. That's why they don't quite sum exactly as you might expect. All right. And as I mentioned, in terms of the areas which are the most at risk, they turn out to be the ones that were already the highest risk. They just also increase the most as well. So Florida, already really high risk, will be hit the most. Hawaii as well, high risk currently, also will be increasing the most. Okay. So this is both interesting in and of itself, but possibly could be related to management strategies in terms of what we can introduce and where we can introduce it. So more recently, we also examined the pet trade broadly in terms of the different elements or stages of that invasion, of that pathway. Now, there are a lot of missing pieces in this, and we tried to summarize all those. But the idea here is that, well, we can start mapping out where species are coming from, right? The characteristics of the species that are coming in, where they're going to be transported to, and we might be able to refine our black and white lists to also incorporate basically those differences in environmental conditions, right? So the different species will not be able to establish everywhere. We will be able to start taking the account and having more refined lists associated with the pest rate. So some of the take-home messages here, again, the higher risk is in the southernmost regions, such as Florida. The risk in Quebec remains very, very low. In this context, climate change was more important for aquarium fish than propagule pressure or changes in propagule pressure, right? So I'm going to switch direction yet again. I'm going to stay at the North American, basically at the continental scale, okay? And now I'm going to look at terrestrial invasions and forest pest management, right? So the specific policy that I'm kind of going to look at is an international policy. It's called ISPM 15, and it essentially is an agreement to treat wood packing material to essentially reduce the introduction of wood-boring pests, which have been shown to be the most damaging pests, right? So it was initially implemented in 2004, and currently it has about 70 signatory countries. And so we were interested in basically, was it worth it? Right? And how do we start answering that question, right? Because these are the kind of statements that policymakers often want to know, right? Because it can also be used to determine or to ask whether we should have more stringent measures, or is there a benefit associated with having more stringent measures, right? So once again, I'm going to tie this to that conceptual model of introduction and establishment and impact, okay? And species are being introduced, right, from some sort of source location, from some species pool, transported to North America or other areas via trade, right, which is essentially propagule pressure, and that propagule pressure ties in with establishment, right? So how does our management strategy, in this case ISPM 15, interact with all these things? Well, essentially what it's going to do is it's going to reduce propagule pressure. And as it reduces propagule pressure, right, we would expect to find a reduction in that probability of establishment, which will translate to a reduced number of established species, which then means that there's less impact or cumulative damages of those species. So essentially, we're looking at averted damages because ISPM 15 was implemented. And then we can examine or compare that against the cost of ISPM 15 to figure out the net present value and see whether it was worthwhile. Right. So once again, we're going to go back to our equation. We're going to look at propagule pressure, link it with the probability of establishment, right? And compare those with our management strategy and see whether things are worthwhile, right? So we had data on the frequency of propagule pressure across different species, okay? We had estimates of proportion of establishment given the different propagule pressures, and we can use that essentially to fit this model and to estimate the relationship between propagule pressure and establishment. And then therefore, if we can also estimate how much propagule pressure is reduced, we can then fit our entire model and estimate the benefits, right? So I'm brushing over a whole lot of details associated with this, all right? But basically, in a number of different studies, we showed the average pest cost, which we estimated to be about $34 million for the average pest. Now, of course, there's many different pests. So most of them turn out to be innocuous. There's a few that turn out to be highly damaging. And when you average across the entire thing, you get about $34 million per average pest. The cost of ISPM 15 was estimated as an initial cost to be about $437 million, so about $500 million for that treatment cost. And that also includes all the adjustments by the economy to essentially ameliorate those. So we don't expect people to just like have business as usual. People are adaptive, and if you impose a cost in one place, they're going to adapt to try to minimize what those costs would be, right? So the actual cost is actually higher than that, right? But it's just that people can adapt, and so the loss to the economy is about $500 million in the United States, right? And in terms of the efficacy of treatment, basically they had surveys before and after ISPM 15, and it was estimated that it reduced propagule pressure by about 52%, right? So it's interesting, right? Because when we first look at these numbers, we were thinking that these are some of the arguments people put forward to say that maybe it's not worthwhile, right? Maybe, the average pest cost and the high treatment cost makes it so possibly not worthwhile. And of course, it's not 100% effective anyways. They're gonna get in, species are gonna get in anyways. And so should we bother doing it? However, when we put all the numbers together and when we start thinking about the aggregation of those pests over time and about how many pests were averted, right? It turns out that several different features came up. So first of all, the most costly category, right? This is from a different study, but the most costly category was actually the urban trees, all right? So they mean the most to people. We spend the most to try to control pests within them, all right? So if we think about at 2050, right? So basically over time, there would be about $11.8 billion expected net benefit associated with having implemented ISPM 15, okay? And that includes also the growth of the economy, right? The need for new materials, right? The need for new treatment, etc. Okay. So the projection is also that it would avert more pests than currently established in the United States by having implemented ISPM 15. And part of that is because the expected trajectories are to increase because trade is also projected to increase, right? Time is also important. So the annual benefit was expected to become positive a few years back in 2016, right? So it still took like 12 years for the annual benefit to actually become positive, right? And the cumulative benefit should become positive based on averted damages in about 2025, right? Now, as I said, that doesn't mean that we have not, that it is 100% effective, right? So even with ISPM 15, the projection is that we would still expect the number of establishments to essentially triple, right? And so people are wondering whether we should have more stringent measures in place, right? So that was an analysis of ISPM 15 at the continental level, right? But since then, we've also started trying to be more fine-grained in our analyses and also think about space and the spread of invasive species as well. And so I'm just doing a shout out here to my previous student, Emma Hudgens, who's currently doing a postdoc in Carleton. And basically, yeah, her talk is in the morning of February 3rd, I think in the municipality section, right? And so using a lot of these similar logic and ideas, right, we can apply them also to phenomena such as the pest spread, right? So different phases of that biological invasion, okay? And we can use some of these key proxies or predictors to help us make our predictions. And so these again include things such as species traits, environmental conditions, and something about humans. So human movement patterns or human characteristics, right? And this just shows basically the predictions from the model again versus the observed ranges of those pests. And, you know, basically the closer we are to this one-to-one line, the better our models are. And basically we can predict them pretty well. And we can predict these across every pest species in the United States. So we're calling this general dispersal kernel model. So Emma is going to also talk about and go further than that and also estimate the impact of these. So basically, she's bringing together some of the really quite recent databases on urban trees, on urban on pest impacts, and these different things to estimate how many trees should die, should be killed, where this should happen, right? Which pest is causing them, how much this is going to cost us. And for her postdoc work at Carleton, she's also going that next step now and also examining the management actions. And she can tell you all about that on Thursday. All right, and just another plug here. I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna keep at continental level, but now I'm gonna go across the pond and talk about Europe. So one of the other projects we have on the go tries to essentially build alien scenarios, right? So basically scenarios of invasive species across the world, of which we're looking across scales. And one of those scales is continental, and one of those continents is Europe. And again, we're bringing together data that we have on what species have invaded which countries. And we also have information on all the different management strategies that have been put in place. And so now we can start examining whether whether we can detect a signal of those management strategies on the patterns of biological invasion. This is all super preliminary and not in a very nice format, but basically just a few key messages associated with this, right? So it turns out that if you just model all management strategies without consideration of what type they are, you can't actually detect the signal, okay? Now, if you start breaking it out, you can start seeing which ones are possibly effective and have much more detail associated with that, okay? So if you break it out into proactive, so before invasion occurs versus reactive, now we can start seeing patterns emerge. And if we break it out even further using statistical techniques, so principal components analyses actually start just looking for correlations between all the different management types, okay? And then each one corresponds with a different type of management, right? So some PC1 would be alert lists, PC2 would be preventative borders, quarantines, PC3 would be eradication, right, et cetera, okay? And when we start taking those into account, we can find that some of these are actually there's evidence, we can detect the impact of some of these much more so than others. And when we bring them all together, basically our models are actually much improved, okay? So R squared is just a measure of fit. The closer it is to 1, the stronger it is. And basically, if you don't include the type of management and you just say management happens, right? How many policies are in place? Basically, we explain about 36% of the variation. Whereas when we incorporate all the breakdown, we explain about 54% of the variation. So that's actually quite a large benefit. If we didn't include management in our predictions, but we did include all these other predictors, so things such as I had discussed before, okay. Hold on. We explain about 36.2% of the variation. So it's really close to this one, okay. But key point here is that management does have a strong impact. We can detect it, and we can identify what type of management is having what kind of impact. All right. So now I'm gonna just finish up and move to a regional scale now. I'm gonna focus in on aquatic invasions in Ontario, of which, well, we examined a number of them, and we were primarily interested in the boater movement patterns, right? So the boater pathway and those vectors, right? So in this case, what we're gonna do is we're gonna once again use a gravity model. So this is similar to the one that we had used at the global level for marine invasions, but now we're gonna use this gravity model to try to predict how boats move around the landscape, okay? And we're gonna use a survey of boaters across the province to help us build the model. And so we obtained about 580 respondents. About a third of those visited multiple lakes. So those ones would potentially cause invasions. And so there's about 250,000 lakes in Ontario. And so that's actually hard to actually model. But we instead took the larger lakes, right? So we took the ones that were about greater than 10 hectares and lower than 52 degrees latitude, which is where most of the population lives and where most of the movement patterns exist, okay? So this incorporated about 781 lakes. And so, again, the things which will cause a boater to go to one area versus another area will be things such as lake attractiveness. So these can include things such as like, does it have fishing there? Does it have boat launches there? Does it, how big is the lake? So these different things can influence the movement patterns. Distance is another predictor as well. In the type of gravity model that we use here, it also incorporates basically that source population, okay? So the source population of boaters, and we're examining where are those boaters going to move to, right? And it also incorporates all the alternative destinations that can be examined, that can go to as well, right? So it's going to weight by that too, right? So these are some of the different elements associated with the boater survey. That boater movement pattern is essentially our proxy of propagular pressure. And then we can again examine what the management effect could be. So we're going to do a counterfactual analyses. We can essentially ask the survey respondents, not only where did you go, right, but also where would you go as well under certain circumstances. And so what we were interested in here was, we know that boat cleaning is really, really effective. Okay, it's the expected, or it's the suggested means by which we can stop aquatic invaders from moving across the landscape. It's been estimated to be, for example, to remove about 90% of the propagules on a boat. Now, we can either do those boat washing for free, or we can charge a user fee, right? So we can examine what the consequence is of those alternative management strategies at different places, all right? So we examine zero cost to wash the boats, $16 to wash a boat, okay? And there's also a time cost. So we estimate that it would take about 15 minutes for someone to wash the boat, okay? Now, it turns out mathematically in our gravity model, it turns out that we can essentially estimate the consequences of these boat washing behaviors, right? For, by just measuring one policy lake and one non-policy lake. So one lake where they have the boat washing station in it, and another one where they do not. Okay. So the kind of changes in behavior that we're interested in here that could affect the efficacy, right? The way that the management would translate, okay, is that the consequence of that boat washing station could be that the individuals may move somewhere else, right? Or they might not go anywhere, right? So we might those trips or lose them entirely, which is going to itself have economic consequences associated with it, okay? And if you redistribute it, well, that can have consequences for the spread of invaders as well. And so these are things that we were interested in trying to estimate what those effects should be. Right, so we go back to our trusty equation here. We make Q a function of the environmental conditions, right? So the probability of not establishing a function of those environmental conditions, right? We again have a measure of propagule pressure here, which is from our gravity model, and we have a shape parameter C here. So by this point, this equation should seem relatively, obvious to you. All right, and then we're going to relate the outcome of these models, right, to the observed patterns of invasions of a number of different aquatic plants and a number of different aquatic invertebrates, right? So we had data for 6 different aquatic plants and 6 different aquatic invertebrates, and we can examine what those relationships should be, all right? So how these models should work, all right? And so then, the movement pattern of that propagule pressure to the different lakes, right, is what the consequence of the management strategy should be. And we can see how many invasions are essentially expected if we did nothing, and also how many of them are averted, right? And so here we have the different species. I don't think you can quite read the details there, but basically there's a blue line here that is the expected number of invasions of that species into 780 lakes in the next 10 years, okay? And basically, as we apply boat washing stations to more and more lakes, right? So one lake all the way up to 128 lakes, right? We're gonna avert more damages, and we're gonna consider 2 scenarios here, one where you don't pay a fee and another one where the boater pays a fee, right? And so both of them, of course, are going to increase, but basically, at the very early stages, if you're paying a fee, oftentimes it's not very effective because, of course, you can go somewhere else. As the number of policy lakes increases, these 2 lines often grow much more closely together, right? And that's because, you can go somewhere else, but most of the time, or a lot of times, it's going to be another policy lake, which is also going to reduce your propagule pressure, right? And so the overall predictions from this is that from the model, we predicted based on the respondents that there would be a high redistribution and loss if you have a high pay scenario. So if you're paying $16, basically 60% of the individual would just go somewhere else if they can, and also roughly 60% of them would also just like not go at all. All right. Now, again, that effective cost diminishes with number of policy lakes, and also some species would be fully mitigated depending upon how many policy lakes you have. Right. And so we can also examine this as a cost effectiveness, right? Where basically we're going to divide how many lakes were mitigated, how many invasions avoided, right? Divided by how many lakes you applied it to, okay? And so if it's free, basically you immediately get a benefit. It goes down primarily because you're dividing through by more and more policy lakes, but the total number of invasions that you avert does increase if you're not if it doesn't cost anything, right? In contrast, if you do have a high cost, $16 per treatment, basically if you have very, very low efficacy if you only have one lake. Again, this is because it can just go somewhere else, and you end up finding some sort of optimal point around 16 lakes. All right, so I'm just going to leave it at that. And we can answer a lot of different questions at this point, right? And really, it ends up being a conversation about what do you want to answer, right? Like what is a problem you're trying to solve? And then we end up having more of a conversation about like what kind of data are available, and then how can we use that to integrate it and to answer those questions, or what kind of questions can we answer that is close enough to what you're interested in. All right, so I think I'm gonna leave it at that and answer any questions that people have.
Thanks so much, Brian. We did have a few questions come in here.
Okay,
firstly, not a question, but we had a remark come in saying that you're doing an amazing job explaining and being engaging in your presentation, and I'd have to agree that I think you did a really great job explaining a very complex situation, right, across a variety of scales. So thank you for that.
I was trying to minimize the equation.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Great. So our first question, although the estimated cost per invasive species is $34 million, the costs in treatment method, i.e. kiln drying wood for pallets, might help stop more than one pest. Does your model address the multiple benefits across a number of species?
Yeah, totally. It was actually at the pathway level. And so the way we modeled pests was actually the entire distribution of costs, okay? And so, that's going to be adjusted for the number of pests that we think we're going to avert.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the last question, is there a way for us to see what factors were used for the lake attractiveness index? Bradley says that's a very clever concept.
Yeah, I do have those. I can't remember. I can't remember if it. Okay, sorry. There's been multiple iterations of these models and multiple people doing them as well. So, some of the factors that are often included are things such as lake size, right? So that's one of the main predictors, but also what are your fishing opportunities there? So like, why are people going to these different lakes? It's going to be based on opportunities, right? For recreation, okay? And other infrastructure things such as like, do you have boat launches, right? Can also come into play, right? The other thing, which is a really strong predictor and is a core element of gravity models, is basically a distance function, right? So we usually don't travel very far, okay? And so we can incorporate that in a number of different ways as well. So it can be either what kind of roads are we going through, right? As well as just pure Euclidean distance, right? So these are just alternative models that can be examined. We use Euclidean distance, but I think we use those other predictors for lake attractiveness.
That's great, Brian. Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we've had come in so far. Brian, do you mind if I share your email address in the chat?
Of course.
If anybody has any additional questions? Okay,
sure,
great.
Sure.
So I will do that now. Too many screens open today, I think. Here we go. Okay, great. There we go. Brian's email is now in the chat. So if you have any additional questions for him, feel free to give him a shout. And otherwise, we're going to have a little 10-minute break before we start our next session on ecosystem resilience. So I'll see you back here at 2 p.m.
Sure.
And thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
All right, thanks, Mackenzie.
Thank you.